I want to take you inside a moment that almost every major news outlet covered, and almost every major news outlet got completely wrong. On April 7th, 2026, inside the United Nations Security Council, China raised its hand and said no. One word, one vote. And within minutes, the Western press had its headline ready. China backs Iran. China protects a destabilizing regime. China is risking the global economy for an ally. Clean, simple, and built on a misunderstanding so fundamental that if you accept it, you will misread everything that happens next in this conflict. Because here is the question that not one of those headlines asked, and I want you to really sit with this before we go any further. China buys more Iranian oil than any other country on earth. A massive portion of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. If that strait stays closed, China loses, badly. China is not a bystander in this disruption. China is one of its biggest economic victims. So then why? Why would the country with the most to lose from a closed strait be the one blocking the resolution designed to reopen it? Why would China veto its own solution? If you can answer that question honestly, and I mean really answer it, not reach for the easy explanation, the entire chessboard flips. This stops being a story about loyalty to Iran. It becomes something far more calculated, far more patient, and far more dangerous to American power than anything a missile can deliver. I'm Stephanie Taylor. This is Strategic Review. And by the end of this video, you will see this veto for exactly what it was. That question has an answer. It is not the answer Western media has been providing. And once you follow the logic through to its conclusion, it reframes not just this vote, but the entire strategic architecture of this conflict. This is not a story about China protecting an ally out of loyalty or ideology. Alliances built on loyalty are fragile. They shift when interests diverge. What we are actually watching is something far more durable, a long-term strategic calculation executed with the kind of patience and precision that Washington currently seems structurally incapable of matching. Let's start with what actually happened at the Security Council, because the details matter, and most of the coverage got them wrong. The resolution that came to a vote on April 7th was originally proposed by Bahrain. On the surface, the language was straightforward. Restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Reasonable, defensible, hard to argue against publicly. But buried inside that resolution was a phrase that anyone with diplomatic experience recognized immediately. All necessary means. In the formal language of the Security Council, that phrase is not wording, it is authorization. Authorization for military action, authorization for escalation, authorization for the use of force, wrapped in the legitimacy of international law. Any country that voted yes was effectively giving a green light to military intervention in one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth. Here is what the coverage did not tell you. The version of the resolution that came to a final vote was not the original version. The original draft was significantly more aggressive. It would have allowed any nation, not just the United States, any nation, to use military force to reopen the strait. Multiple countries, including China, Russia, and notably France, pushed back hard on that language. They said this goes too far. The draft was revised. The offensive force authorization was softened. China and Russia still vetoed it. The resolution was revised again. References tying it to direct Security Council enforcement authority were removed. The document had been diluted substantially from where it started. China and Russia vetoed it again, and the Western narrative remained exactly the same throughout all three versions: China and Russia protecting Iran. But here is the analytical question that framing never asks. If China revised the resolution once and then still said no, and revised it again and still said no, then the problem was never the specific language. The problem was the resolution itself, what it would accomplish, what it would enable, what it would prove. To understand that, you have to stop asking what China said and start asking what China's actions actually achieved. That is the only question in geopolitics that produces real answers. China imports somewhere between 10 and 11 million barrels of oil every single day. A substantial portion of that flows through Hormuz. Short term, a sustained blockade is painful for China. That is accurate. That is what the Western coverage correctly identifies. What the Western coverage does not identify is that China has never, not once in its modern strategic history, made major decisions based on short-term pain. China calculates in decades. Its entire strategic culture is built around absorbing near-term costs in exchange for long-term structural advantage. So the question is not whether the Hormuz disruption hurts China today. The question is what that disruption makes possible for China 10 years from now. And when you ask it that way, the veto stops looking like a contradiction and starts looking like exactly what it was: a calculated move, executed with precision. Let me walk you through the layers, because each one builds on the last, and the full picture only becomes visible when you hold all of them together. The first layer is legitimacy. Even in its diluted, softened form, the resolution would have given the United States something more valuable than permission. It would have given the United States legitimacy. The United Nations Security Council, the highest formal authority in international law, saying explicitly, you have the right to use force in and around the Strait of Hormuz. You have the authority to secure it. Once military action carries that kind of international backing, it is no longer just power. It is power with approval. And those are two very different things in terms of what they allow you to do next, how long you can sustain it, and how the rest of the world is required to respond. A unilateral American military operation is something the world can criticize and refuse to endorse. A UN-authorized operation is something the world is legally expected to accept. The difference is enormous between an action that erodes American standing and one that reasserts it globally. Now apply that to China's strategic position. If the United States steps in, reopens the strait by force, and compels Iran into submission, all under the cover of UN legitimacy, the signal that sends to the world is unambiguous. America still controls the most critical energy choke points on the planet. Even in an era where American decline has been extensively documented, the United States can still decide who gets access to energy and who doesn't. For China, that outcome is not just bad, it is structurally catastrophic, because it means China is back where it has always feared being: dependent. Dependent on American-controlled sea lanes, dependent on a system where, at any moment Washington decides, China's oil supply can be threatened. In Chinese strategic thinking, this vulnerability has a name: the Malacca Dilemma, the fear that the U.S. Navy can strangle China's economy by controlling key maritime choke points. China has spent decades building alternatives: overland pipelines, Indian Ocean port infrastructure, energy partnerships that bypass American-controlled routes, all of it predicated on one assumption: that China will not remain permanently dependent on routes Washington can close. A UN-legitimized American operation reopening Hormuz would shatter that assumption. It would prove, with international legal backing, that American choke point control is not declining. It is being reasserted. If America wins here, China loses. Not tactically, structurally. That makes the veto not optional. It makes it necessary. That is the first layer. Now the second. When China vetoed that resolution, it preserved something more valuable than a blocked vote: ambiguity. And in geopolitics, ambiguity is leverage. As long as Hormuz remains unresolved through official channels, China retains a card it can play at a time of its choosing. Future support for a revised resolution becomes a bargaining chip in negotiations, with no direct connection to Iran. Trade terms, technology access, Taiwan-adjacent issues. The range of things a permanent Security Council member can extract in exchange for a yes vote is essentially unlimited. The moment China votes yes, for any reason, that card is spent. Keeping it unplayed keeps the leverage alive. China is not primarily protecting Iran here. China is preserving its own negotiating position in a conflict environment where that position may be the most valuable asset any major power holds. Third layer, the petrodollar system. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil route. It is infrastructure for the dollar-based energy trading system that has underpinned American financial dominance since the 1970s. Oil priced in dollars, settled in American financial institutions. This architecture is what allows the United States to impose sanctions that actually work, to cut countries off from global finance, to use economic pressure as a substitute for military action. China has been working to erode that architecture for over a decade. Yuan-denominated oil contracts, alternative payment systems bypassing SWIFT, bilateral currency arrangements that settle trade without touching the dollar. The Belt and Road as physical infrastructure for a post-dollar trade network. Every week Hormuz stays disrupted, keeps maximum pressure on that dollar-based system. Every surge in energy prices pushes more countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America to ask whether a more resilient alternative exists. China has already been building those alternatives. The disruption accelerates the demand for them. From this perspective, the veto is an economic weapon, not directed at Iran, directed at the structural foundations of American financial power. Fourth layer, and arguably the most underestimated, the narrative. China is telling a story that resonates across much of the world. We are not escalating. We are not striking first. We are saying that international rules should apply to everyone, not just to countries the Security Council's permanent Western members find convenient. That story lands differently in different places. In Western Europe, it sounds like propaganda. In most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, regions with long memories of Western-imposed instability, it sounds like an accurate description of how the world works. China does not need to win the narrative battle inside the United States. It needs to win it in the regions that will define the global order over the next 30 years. Positioning itself as a defender of sovereignty, while the U.S. is framed as a country that acts first and seeks legal cover afterward, is an extraordinarily effective long-term strategy. And the veto amplified that positioning at precisely the moment of maximum global attention. When you put all four layers together, legitimacy denial, leverage preservation, petrodollar pressure, narrative positioning, you stop seeing a defensive move made on behalf of an ally. You start seeing a multi-dimensional strategic operation executed at low cost and high precision against the structural foundations of American global power. No armies, no strikes, no casualties, just one word at one table at one carefully chosen moment. Now, I want to address the counter-argument because it is a fair one and it deserves a serious response. The argument goes like this. China's veto might be clever short-term, but China is still bleeding from the oil disruption. China cannot sustain this forever. At some point, Beijing will have to support reopening the Strait of Hormuz because the economic cost of keeping it closed becomes unsustainable. That sounds reasonable. In many contexts, it would be correct. But it rests on an assumption that does not hold when you examine it carefully. The assumption is that time is neutral, that it passes at the same rate and with the same consequences for all parties. It is not. Time is not neutral in this conflict. Time is a weapon. And the question is not whether China can endure the disruption indefinitely. Nobody can. The question is, who runs out of time first? Look at what America is spending in this conflict. Not just money, though the financial cost is substantial. America is spending interceptor missile stockpiles that take years to replenish. It is spending political capital with allies who have their own election cycles and their own red lines. It is spending domestic public patience, which polling data shows is already under measurable stress. It is spending the credibility of institutions, the State Department, the intelligence community, the military, that have staked their reputations on outcomes that have not materialized on the timeline publicly projected. There is something else rarely named directly: the coherence of the strategic narrative itself. When promised timelines slip and claims prove more complicated than advertised, the narrative does not just weaken, it becomes a liability opponents can use. And right now, opponents are using it. Wars are not sustained by weapons alone. They are sustained by public consent and financial endurance. Both are more fragile inside a democratic system under media scrutiny and electoral pressure than most people acknowledge. And both are being consumed faster on the American side than on the Chinese side. Iran is not operating from American assumptions either. Iran has spent decades, not years, decades, building a strategic culture around endurance. Sanctions, isolation, military confrontation, economic pressure. These are not exceptional circumstances for Tehran. They are the baseline. Iran has built its entire national security posture, its entire economy, its entire social contract with its population around surviving exactly this kind of prolonged attrition. It does not need to win quickly. It needs to avoid losing fast. Those are very different strategic objectives, and they require very different resource commitments. The side trying to win quickly is under pressure. The side willing to endure is not. China is feeling the pressure, but it is feeling it with buffers, strategic petroleum reserves, overland Central Asian supply corridors, domestic energy expansion, and a governing system that can absorb economic pain without worrying about the next election cycle. If America is bleeding political support, strategic credibility, and economic stability faster than China is bleeding energy security, and the evidence suggests it is, then the party that benefits from delay is not Washington, it is Beijing. And that is precisely what the veto accomplished. It did not resolve the crisis. It extended it. It stretched the timeline. It prevented a fast, legitimized American win. And in doing so, it ensured that the costs keep accumulating on the side that can least afford to absorb them indefinitely. This is the dimension of the conflict that conventional military analysis consistently misses. It treats this as a contest measured in missiles fired and targets destroyed. It is not. It is a contest over systems, over legitimacy, over endurance, over who gets to define the terms of the global order that emerges on the other side of this. And here is the deeper point that I think is the most important thing I can leave you with today. The United States built its post-World War II dominance not primarily through military force, though military force was always there as a backstop. It built it through institutions, through the UN system, through Bretton Woods, through the IMF and World Bank, through the WTO, through a web of international rules and norms that, not coincidentally, reflected American interests and American values, and that gave American power a legitimacy it could not have purchased through force alone. For decades, China watched how that system worked and concluded that the most efficient path to replacing American primacy was not to confront that system militarily, which would be enormously costly and uncertain, but to use it, to participate in it, to gain standing within it, and then, at strategic moments, to deny its use to American power while simultaneously presenting yourself as its defender. That is what happened on April 7th. China did not attack the UN system. China used the UN system, specifically the veto mechanism that is the cornerstone of great power management within that system, to deny the United States the legitimacy it needed for a particular military objective. And it did so while publicly framing itself as the defender of international law and the opponent of unilateral military escalation. It is, frankly, a masterclass in the use of institutional power. And the fact that it is being covered primarily as evidence of Chinese support for Iran tells you more about the analytical limitations of current Western media than it tells you about what China actually did. Iran is fighting for survival. America is fighting for credibility. China is fighting for something structurally larger than either: the slow, deliberate erosion of a U.S.-dominated international system that has constrained Chinese strategic autonomy for decades. And China is pursuing that objective in the most resource-efficient way imaginable. No armies deployed, no strikes launched, no human cost, just institutions, timing, leverage, and the willingness to say no at the precise moment when the other side needs yes. That is what a Security Council veto actually is, stripped of the procedural language. It is a strategic weapon in diplomatic form. It delays, it denies, it frustrates. It reshapes outcomes without requiring a single military action. And on April 7, 2026, China used that weapon with precision that most Western analysts have not yet begun to accurately assess. Years from now, historians examining this conflict may not identify the turning point as a bombing campaign or a naval engagement. They may identify it as the moment China looked at the United States, looked at the assembled Security Council, and with a single word, a single procedural action, changed the trajectory of the entire war. Not by winning a battle, by making sure the right side wins the weight. This is Strategic Review. I'm Stephanie Taylor. If this framework is useful to you, share it with one person in your network who is still reading the headlines and missing the strategy underneath. Subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in the next transmission.